Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. He comes to us from Las Vegas. His name is Mark Gray, Gray, and he's just published a book, 2025. If you're watching this on my YouTube channels, which I got back, X, Rumble, Rockfin, you'll see the title of the book is The Las Vegas Massacre Connections, Finding Strength Through Tragedy After America's Deadliest Mass Shooting. And this is his first book. He has a contribution from Mary Jo Bontillo, who we'll find out who that is. But he's an accomplished author of a lot of magazine articles. He's a longtime writer for People Magazine and Rolling Stone. He's originally from SLC, Salt Lake City, and he's been in Vegas for a couple decades. He was there on the events that we're going to talk about today, which is October 1st, 2017. The biggest mass shooting in American history still reverberates around today. A lot of mystery there, but he can talk more about that. There's a lot of tragedy and trauma and a lot of people coping still to this day, and it's covered in his book. He was part of magazine coverage of O.J. Simpson's robbery case and Prince Harry's Vegas shenanigans. He's interviewed a lot of people and even the President of the United States. So we're delighted to have Mark Gray on the show. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's a delight to be here.
For people who haven't heard your name or heard the book, maybe you can talk a little bit about your writing background and the genesis of this book, The Las Vegas Massacre Connections.
Yeah, so I've been a longtime writer, journalist for newspapers, magazines, primarily newspapers and magazines. Local newspaper in Little Ogden, Utah, for several years after college, and moved to Las Vegas in 2005. Did public relations for a quick cup of coffee, and then got hired by People Magazine shortly thereafter, and I've been working for them ever since. Going to be started in fall 2006, and I'm now the freelance route where I can work for pretty much anybody. And I've worked for People Magazine and Rolling Stone and Entertainment Weekly and MSN and various Vegas publications and things like that. I had a radio show for about 2 years or so in Las Vegas as well, covering entertainment. And and then this book sort of started just on a regular, everyday, coverage situation. I was hired by Rolling Stone to cover this festival, which was a 3-day festival, country music dominant, on the Las Vegas Strip, called the Route 91 Harvest Festival. And the initial story was supposed to be the 10 best things I saw this weekend at Route 91. And of course, Jason Aldean was the final act of the final day on the third day. And so 9 of those 10 items were ready to go and written. And I was kind of earmarking one space for Jason Aldean. And obviously that item on Aldean, and nor did that story ever see the light of day, because things changed very dramatically on the 4th song of Jason Aldean's set, just about 15 minutes into the set.
Right. So just this fire thing. Were you actually on site at the festival, in the festival?
I was. Yeah, I was. And I believe I was the only print reporter there at the time. There had been media there the whole time, but a lot of them were doing backstage interviews, and I was certainly one of them. But most of those people left after the interviews ended because, again, Jason Aldean was the final act, so there was no more interviews that were going to be taking place. They were all finished. So all the other reporters left. I, however, stayed. I had a bunch of friends that were there, so I was hanging out with them and just kind of enjoying the show and working a bit, on my 10 best things article. And I was the only one. I was the only one there, I believe, from the print standpoint, from the reporter standpoint. And I only believe this because I've not seen a single thing in the 8 years since. Now there were a couple, I think 2 photographers there that were working, but from a reporter standpoint, I think it was just me.
And it started late at night, right? It was like 10 p.m., right? It was kind of a late hour, if I remember correctly, right? Can you do me a favor, Mark? And can you turn off your video? There's just it just seems to be a bit choppy, like it's a little slow. So if you turn off your video, it'll help with the connection. It's just on the very bottom. There you go. Perfect.
There we go.
Please continue.
Yeah. So the show itself started in the afternoon, but Jason Aldean's set began around about 9:50 or so in the evening, and But the shooting began at 10:05, and it lasted for 11 minutes. And those 11 minutes that none of us will ever really forget.
Right. So I mean, and a lot of people, they didn't respond right away. They were kind of confused and didn't understand what was really happening. I mean, how long did it take for you to realize that there was a mass shooting taking place?
It's tough to say. It's kind of like when someone, I mean, you're in LA, I think, William, right? I mean, it's kind of like these people when they say in the earthquake, it felt like it was, 10 minutes, but it was really 30 seconds. And this was kind of how that was too, in the sense that I remember I was standing there and there were 3 pops. It went pop, 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 and there was a very long pause. And at the time, myself and I think pretty much everyone there didn't think anything of it. I thought it was fireworks. I kind of thought maybe someone stuck some fireworks in there and brought maybe a bottle rocket or something to the concert. And then there were 3 more pops after that, and then another pause. And the same thing, I thought, what kind of jerk is doing this? We're all enjoying the show. What's happening? And then that's when the barrage of bullets started happening. And it was pretty quickly after that, probably I would guess within a matter of 7 or 8 seconds, 9 seconds, that I realized something wasn't right here. And at the time, though, a lot of us, myself included, and a bunch of my friends who were there, we all thought that someone was inside the festival. I didn't find out until hours later that it was inside Mandalay Bay. We thought it was someone in the festival, and maybe potentially multiple people. We weren't sure of really anything. It was one of those things that I remember. We had a friend of mine was a sponsor of the festival, and so he had a kind of VIP area, but it wasn't really protection. It was more protection than most people had. It was basically it had a refurbished trucking container, essentially, but it had windows in it. It was very thin, and I ran in there, much like all of my friends did, and just kind of got down on the ground. And we were on the ground for, again, felt like an eternity. And we were thinking we're sitting ducks here at some point, because, again, we thought someone was inside the festival. And there was a couple breaks during the barrage of shooting, most of them very short. And, investigators believe it's because he was going from gun to gun and window to window, because he had a corner suite and he had guns positioned at both windows. So they think he was done shooting here, moving over to the other place. And that was the break in the shooting. So it was during one of those breaks that we all decided
Mark, hold on just a sec. You can't keep moving the mic around. You got to just stay stable, or something's going on. The mic has a lot of background noise. So please put your mic somewhere and don't move it. If you have an Apple cord mic, just hold on to it with your hand, please.
I gotcha. Okay. Yeah. So it was, it was during one of those breaks in the shooting that we kind of thought, this probably is our time to go. And that was what we did. So I was there working, remember? And so I had my laptop there. I had my livelihood really there. So I had actually crawled the ground over to the corner where a file cabinet was sitting, where I kept my laptop for the evening. And I got that, and that's when I left. And it was, you weren't really sure what was going on until you got out of there. And when I was starting to make my way out of the festival, it was just pure chaos, pure carnage. And that's when you started seeing, bodies and, injuries and all things like that. And it was really a war zone.
It really was. I mean, I think that there was over 50 deaths and then 500 injuries. So it's like some of those, like, they forget that so many people were really injured in this event. It's a huge, huge event. I mean, it's incredible. And what was the fallout like when you were in Vegas, like after the events of October 1st, 2017?
This city still isn't the same. It's in the immediate fallout of this. I mean, it was like a funeral for the city. It really was. I mean, it was just such a dark cloud hovering over this place. And at that time, I'd been in Vegas for about 12 years, and so I knew it pretty well, certainly the ins and the outs of it, and I still do. But it was It was like nothing I'd ever experienced. It really felt like you were just living inside of a funeral home. There was people lined, and you also saw the humanitarian angle of Vegas and the side that no one really sees. Because when people think of Vegas, they think glitz, glamour, and neon sign. What we really had was, yeah, it was still existing, but you had people lining up at blood banks to donate. You had, people donating food, water, money, you name it. And that was really kind of I don't want to say a silver lining, but it was really kind of a lone bright spot of such a horrible evening, such a horrible tragedy.
Right. So that was it. So what happened to your series on the Harvest Festival? Did you end up publishing something else in Rolling Stone?
Correct. So after I got home that evening, which, I had Ubered down to the festival, so I didn't have a car there. And of course, the Ubers were all, you couldn't get one to save your life. There was no cabs because the roads were all shut down. And so it took me a while to get home. Once I finally did, I decided to, I was stunned first off. And then I decided to write a first person story about my experience. I wasn't trying to claim this is what anyone else did or what anyone else felt. This was just my experience. And so I just started writing, and it was incredibly raw, from what I understand. I've still not read it to this day, William, but I wrote the story and I sent it in. Again, just a first person story. And of course, when you're a regular everyday reporter like I was, you're not supposed to write first person stories. You're supposed to be, incredibly unbiased, not throw yourself into the article. And that was what I did. I put myself right in the article, sent it in. And my thought process was, if you don't like it, well, to hell with you, because I got shot and you didn't. So I sent it in, and it did really, really well. Rolling Stone published it pretty much immediately, and it kind of really changed the trajectory of my career in some ways, because it really put my name on the map in areas that I was not known in.
Right. So you were like a standard kind of entertainment writer in that till that time. Would that be correct?
Correct. And I was doing, I was kind of doing to a lot of red carpets and interviewing celebrities and all that kind of stuff. And I was never really in the hard news area.
Right. Pretty well. So this is 2017. And how did you kind of meet up with some of you mentioned a lot of names in this book. I mean, how did it get started? How did you meet Mary Jo Vontillo, and then kind of take it from there?
Yeah. So I was it was 4.5 years after the shooting. Rolling Stone had approached me about doing a 5-year anniversary story. And so I said, sure, I'm all in on this. And I was speaking with a different reporter, one of my colleagues there, and he had mentioned that he knew that a lot of these survivors of the shooting, people who had been shot, people who had lost, loved ones, all went to one specific Los Angeles Angels baseball game every year. It was always in May, and they always went to this one game, and I'd never heard of this. And so I contacted a woman who was kind of in charge of it, and she let me in and introduced me to a bunch of these people. And so I was at this game, and this woman sitting in front of me, and I had been told in advance, like, who would be sitting around me at this game. And I spoke to this woman, and she had really not a lot of interest in speaking to me at the time. Her name was Mary Jo Vontillo. And eventually, as time went on, I kind of wore her down, I think. And thankfully, baseball's a very long game. And I had 9 innings to wear her down, and she finally agreed to speak with me briefly. And so we spoke only in a matter of 5 minutes, maybe less. And it was a very Cliff Notes version of what happened that night with her. And she was there with her husband and her family. Her husband, Kurt, was shot in the collarbone, and the bullet eventually went straight to his heart, went through the collarbone into his heart, and he died instantaneously. And she kind of spoke about, they'd gone every year to that festival, and Kurt was there with her, obviously, and kind of gave me sort of just the rundown of the day. And it was interesting. And I put her story in that Rolling Stone article on the 5-year anniversary story. And I figured that was that, and I would never hear from her again. A year later, my phone rings, and it was her. And she said, I wanted to speak to you about this idea for a book I have. and would you be interested in collaborating with me on this thing? And so I eventually met up with she. At the time, lived in Southern California. I flew down there. We went to lunch all day together and just went over really her story that evening, her story with Kurt, her love story with Kurt, everything about how they met, you name it. And I left there not really knowing what I had, whether this was good enough to start a book or whether this was just a nice woman with an interesting story, whether this was a magazine article. And it kind of started from there. And I just started chatting with more folks and more people. And I was really leaning on her to introduce me to these people who she's met along the way. And every person in this book has had some form of trauma in and of themselves. And a lot of people think about this book as a Route 91 book, and that's not what it is at its core. What I like to say is this book starts at Route 91 and it kind of works its way through and everything that's happened since that day. And it's really all the people she's met because of Route 91, because that event happened. And, and there's a couple stories in there. There's one guy who has a similar story to her. He lost his wife at Route 91, but there's other stories in there have nothing to do with it. And it's just sort of this, she's sort of the tie the thread that ties all these people together.
Right. And there was a huge court case too. A lot of people didn't follow up maybe, but there was litigation, and that also it was a class action. So that also brought a lot of the survivors together too. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. It's a class action suit. And there was also when things like this happen, there's typically the government or the local entity typically starts a GoFundMe. It's an official GoFundMe, but they're not really sure of how to deal with this, how to divvy out the money. So they always hire this one particular guy. His name's Jeff Dion. They all go to Jeff Dion, who is probably the most trauma-informed man in the country. And he kind of goes through it, and he has almost a pyramid of sorts for how to this person gets this. If someone was lost a spouse, they get this. If someone was shot critically, they get this. If someone was shot, kind of a grazed, a flesh wound, they get this. If someone has psychological trauma, they get this. So he has a whole system, a whole chart, and he's actually featured in the book as well as to how he even got involved in that. And it also relates to true crime. His sister was murdered by a serial killer, and that kind of thrust him into this world of being a victim's rights attorney, and which led him into this life as well. But yeah, there was a civil lawsuit, a class action lawsuit, which involved the hotel, and there was also another. There were different lawsuits all kind of filtered throughout, and Mary Jo was involved in the class action against MGM, which owned Mandalay Bay Hotel, and then saying she got her share of the GoFundMe as well, just like many of the other victims did as well.
Are you aware of how much money was raised by GoFundMe? Because that's separate from the class action suit, right?
That is separate. Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head. I can certainly find out, but I don't know how much it was.
There was a huge public outpouring, if I remember. And Jeff Dion, his sister was killed. I think her name was Jeanette or Janelle in 1980. Paulette, thank you. By none other than Otis Toole, which is really scary. Like, it's not, that guy's probably one of the darkest figures imaginable.
Correct.
So Jeff Dion, personal, and I was watching videos about him this morning. He's still kind of on video about this whole Route 91 massacre. So yeah, it is remarkable. I think he's like a leader in that field of what he does, right?
He is. Yeah. What's interesting about Route 91 and why he probably still speaks about it is it's one of those weird, at least from my standpoint, certainly, it's one of those odd mass casualty events that I don't think people have forgotten, but they've also sort of forgotten. I mean, you remember Columbine. People talk about Columbine to this day. People talk about, Parkland to this day. People talk about the Pulse nightclub and, Uvalde, some of these others. But Vegas is not usually at the top of the list, which ironically, it's the biggest, the biggest one in terms of death. But, I remember just even 3 weeks after I was in Northern California, and I was in an Uber, and I'd mentioned this driver had said, "Why are you here?" And I told him I was kind of getting away from what? I mentioned I was in the shooting. He said, "Oh yeah, I totally forgot about that." That was only 3 weeks at that point. So it's still a big deal in Vegas, but I think a lot of people have forgotten how large this actually was.
Yeah, I mean, it was huge, huge. And then Polaris says he'd like to see the legal briefings. You mentioned you read the two reports. There were after action reports by FEMA and the Las Vegas MPD criminal investigative report. You went through those, right?
I did. Yeah, there was this very lengthy.
What did you find anything new, or was there any facts in there that you'd like to share that people may not know of?
I didn't really learn anything new per se. What I learned was more of the police response, how many bullets were actually fired, things like that. Really at the end of the day, this all comes down to the motive, and no one's ever really figured out the motive. When I went into this book, one thing I said I wasn't going to do was two things. I was not going to name the shooter, which I didn't do. And I also said I wasn't going to try to relitigate this thing, because to me, this book was not about the shooter or really the motive. It was about these people and these victims who have dealt with trauma and overcome trauma, and, kind of sort of a silver lining situation. And so I knew I had to dive deep into what happened that evening, but that wasn't really that wasn't sort of the underlying issue here. It wasn't sort of the reason for the book or the premise of the book. So yeah, I went through it, and I don't know that I learned a ton because I think there's so much mystery here. There's so much about, but again, I think all the mystery lies with one real question as to why. Why did this guy do this? This man was a millionaire. He certainly seemed to be doing just fine for himself. He had multiple homes, and the problems that he, these financial problems that he had are probably problems we would all love to have, where we didn't have to worry about money as much. And but yeah, that my job wasn't to go in and figure out, let's kind of dig into this guy's life, dig into the way the hotel went about letting this guy use the freight elevator and things like that. That wasn't the purpose of this. So right. I did learn about a lot of that, but it really wasn't what I was focused on.
It's kind of nice you actually take a victim-centered approach, which usually in true crime doesn't happen. So see how this works out and how it reverberates through these people's lives. There were it's kind of like a cross-section of America was there. There's a lot of different, there's ex-military, there's, I think this one woman, Lawler, was in entertainment. So there's a bunch of different kind of stories interwoven in this, from this event, right?
Yeah, and it's all these people who Mary Jo has met, again, because of that day. And you're right, it varies across section of America, and all these stories are vastly different. Say the ex-military, his name's Tony Berditis. Tony's story is the most similar to Mary Jo's. He was there at Route 91 with his wife. They were actually staying somewhat near each other at the time. They didn't know each other at that time, but his story is pretty similar. But yeah, I mean, Jeff Dion's story is vastly different, where his sister, as we mentioned, was killed by Tool, and that really and that murder shaped his life. He became a lawyer because of that event. Really, that was really kind of what started him on that road.
Wow. I didn't know that.
We talked to Lindsay Lawler, she's a singer-songwriter in Nashville, who she has a Sirius XM radio show for the trucking industry, and how she became involved was, Kurt Von Tillo, Mary Jo's husband who died, was a trucker. So she became involved in Mary Jo's life, and it turns out she's had her own trauma. She was sexually assaulted by a record executive, and how she's overcome that. We talked to one guy, Dion Green, who has an incredible story. Dion Green was a former drug dealer who went to prison. He paid his dues, and he got out and turned his life around. One day he was there in 2019, and he's in his home, and a tornado starts running through his home in Dayton, Ohio. Tornado comes through, and it just almost levels his home. It really made it unlivable. And so he was cleaning up his home for about 6 weeks or so straight, just daily, just cleaning different things up, trying to see if he could, salvage this home. he decided to take a break one night. He called his father, who hadn't seen a lot of. He called him and said, let's go down and have some drinks in one area of town, the Oregon District. He went there. They were on their way out of the bar, leaving to go home, and a man rounded the corner in full body armor and started shooting. And Dion Green's father, his name was Derek Fudge, was shot and died in Dion's arms. So within a matter of weeks, literally a month and a half, 2 months, Dion Green's lost his home and his father. So, and he's turned his life around. He now starts he has a foundation for at-risk youths, which all started to honor his father.
Gotcha. And then there's another one. Tommy Mayer was there. That guy. He has another story too, right?
Yeah, Tommy Mayer was still is a fire commissioner in New York, in Long Island. His childhood best friend, was named Joe Hunter, and Joe Hunter died in 9/11. There was actually a video of Joe going into the building. It's one of the many news reports of firefighters rushing in, and he was one of those guys. And unfortunately, Joe never came out. They found his helmet only, and that helmet is now with the museum, the 9/11 museum. But so Tommy was just distraught over losing his best friend, and Tommy was down there at Ground Zero for weeks on end, helping with recovery efforts. For 20 years, he tried to figure out how he could help out or honor his friend, and he could never figure out how to do it. And Tommy is, just a golden individual of a man. He's just a saint, and he just could not figure out how to help, how to help out humanity and how to really honor Joe. When the Vegas shooting happened, he had an epiphany one night, and he said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my van, which he already had. I'm going to take my van and I'm going to drive it to the hometowns of all the people who were shot and killed in Las Vegas. And I'm going to do a random act of kindness on my own dime in their name. And so what he would do is he would drive to these different hometowns, and he'd always create these little kind of slips, little pieces of paper. And it would say, something, courtesy of, and he'd say the person's name, victim of the Route 91, Harvest Festival shooting in Las Vegas. And he'd usually research these people who he was honoring. And if they liked, basketball or something, he would go to a public basketball court and he would leave free basketballs or, uniforms or something like that. If this person liked coffee, he might go to Starbucks and he'd buy the next 20 people coffee. And he'd all give them the slip to know why, so they would understand why this coffee is being purchased for them. And he delved deep into their birthdays, and he might just do a random act of kindness on their birthday. And, but if someone had a flat tire, he might give them a new tire, courtesy of so-and-so. And so he did this just for years, and eventually, and that took off. And that's how he met Mary Jo Montillo, the distributor of the book. He was in Southern California doing random acts of kindness in Kurt's name. Mary Jo had never heard of this Tommy man before. And her cousin had informed her of someone who was, kind of using Kurt's name. And she said, who is this guy? It must be someone who is, looking for money or scamming someone or, maybe for religious purposes or something like that. And it turned out he was just a man with a good heart. And she ended up meeting him and realized within 5 minutes that this guy was just and pure. And that's all he wanted to do was just honor his buddy. And so that's how Tommy kind of fell into this book as well, was he just goes around and does these kind of things. And he didn't stop in Vegas. Vegas was the first time he did it, but he travels around to all these mass casualty events now and does these kind of, random acts of kindness and helps out. He's been, he went to Uvalde. He went to the borderline shooting in Thousand Oaks, California. He went to Pittsburgh after the synagogue shooting. He's been all around, and he still does to this day.
Oh, that's amazing. And there's a lot of shootings. There's a lot of crazy things still happening. This is part of a larger social problem, are these weird mass shootings that reverberate, whether it's polls. I mean, there's just so many. Like, there has to be a list of these mass shootings. It's really incredible. This is the one I can't think of one that's worse because 500 people were injured. I mean, those kind of stories kind of get lost too, though, like the injuries. Would you agree with that?
Totally agree. Yeah, I mean, we focus on the 58. Well, that's the other thing about Vegas that's so bizarre is we can't even agree on how many people died that night. It's the number's either 58 or 60. Um, and they're two different camps. I live in the 58 camp, but some people live in the 60 camp. And the reason why is this is that evening on October 1, 2017, 58 people lost their lives. Years later, two other people lost their lives due to injuries suffered that night. So
Right.
those two other families, yeah, those two other families, I'm, I get it. They want to be included in this. I understand it. But the whole argument is, 58 people, didn't get to say goodbye to their loved one. These other families had, a year or 2 years to say goodbye. So it's tough to equate those ones. But yeah, 58 people died. And then there's also differing numbers on how many people were injured. The number that I see a lot is 851. And that includes everything from, serious injuries to someone who may have hurt their foot for all we know. There's just so many different numbers that are flying around on this whole thing. And 600 is the number you hear a lot. You hear 800. I hear 851. So again, it's just so bizarre because one of those, huge events where we really can't agree on anything.
It's pretty murky. Like there's a lot of murky stuff. Like, I mean, what's it like being in Vegas? Like when you're hearing other, I mean, I've heard of other people hearing shots in other casinos, shots coming from weird directions. Like that's the whole general confusion is like a lot of people were like you who said that they thought somebody was in the festival shooting, which is kind of different than hearing something up on the, halfway up a large, huge hotel. What's it like the rumors or innuendo or whatever? I mean, being in Vegas, what are other people saying about the event?
There's so many different people that talk about it in terms of, I don't believe what was released. I don't believe the police now, and I don't really give a whole lot of oxygen to the conspiracy theories myself because it doesn't change the fact that 58 or 60 people, depending on how you feel, it doesn't change the fact that these people lost their lives. It doesn't change the fact that all 22,000 of us, myself included, went through emotional trauma. So I don't really give a lot of those theories a whole lot of thought or a whole lot of oxygen. I was actually talking to Mary Jo Vontillo just a few weeks ago. She was in Las Vegas, and we were talking about the number of bullets fired, which was 1,057 bullet casings they found in the guy's room. And she said, I don't really care about the number 1,057. I care about the one that hit my husband, which I thought was an interesting way of looking at it. Makes sense. And so and she has the same feeling about kind of these stories that have come through about, oh, well, maybe this guy was this way. Maybe he was this way. Maybe there were, I've heard the whole thing about we're all actors. I said, you're going to get 22,000 actors in there. That's kind of incredible. I don't think I've acted since I was a tree in elementary school on stage, but so it's one of those things where, and most people in Vegas, I don't want to put words in people's mouths, but I tend to think based on what I've heard, most people believe that it was one guy in Mandalay Bay in an elevated position shooting down at us.
Gotcha. And is Mary Jo still going to these Angel baseball games and meeting with the other survivors? Are they still meeting up every year?
Yeah, so they didn't do it last year. I don't know why, but she's been to, I believe, 3 of them. They did 5 or 6 of them, and she's been to 3. She went to the initial one, and then she went to when I met her, which was prior to the 5-year anniversary, and then she went prior to the 6-year anniversary game as well. And they always there's always a country concert on the field after the game's over. So it's kind of it really ties into, the Route 91 of it all. And they call it, the Angels market it Country Weekend. So it's not just solely about Route 91.
Right. Gotcha. And how do you think, like, are a lot of these people seeking the help of like grief counselors, psychological help, or how are people dealing with the trauma now that it's like 8 years after?
None of us are ever the same. None of us ever will be. But I know a lot of people, certainly in the early stages, were dealing with therapists and grief counselors. I mean, I went to a therapist for a session, and um, just to kind of get my head right and kind of talk about how I was feeling about it, and I felt like I was pretty good after that. Some people didn't go at all. Many people are still going. And it's one thing I've realized is you can't judge anyone based on how they felt. We all had there were 22,000 of us there, but every one of us had a different experience. A lot of our stories started the same way. We were there watching a concert, and then we heard bullets, and then it seems like everyone's story is different after that. But a lot of these people are still going through the motions. I've met people over the years, and even after this book has come out, who they've kind of made Route 91 has kind of become their life. And, that's not what my life has become, certainly. And obviously, you could argue, well, how is it not when you release this book? I get that argument. But some people, it's really kind of become sort of their calling card is this one evening of their lives. And I don't blame them for it. It's just not the way I'm going about doing it, not the way I feel.
Right. I mean, it's such an important event, such a huge event. Your book has 24 5-star reviews now on Amazon. It's on Kindle, audiobook, paperback, hardcover, so people can get it now. I think the actual publication date, if I'm correct, if this is the right one for Amazon, was just October, so it's only been out a couple, three weeks. Is there anything you'd like to add or anything I missed before we wrap it up, Mark?
I don't think so. I think we've really kind of encapsulated what this book is all about. It's one of those things where, and again, I kind of mentioned it earlier, but a lot of people think this is a Route 91 book, and it really isn't. It's more about, this is truly a book for the victims. And there are books about that evening that are out there. Not as many as you would think, considering the massive scope of this thing. But every book that I'm aware of, at least, and I think I've done enough research on it. Every book is about the shooter, from the shooter standpoint, or from the standpoint of a first responder. And there's nothing, and those are all wonderful and great. Whether it's a EMT, whether it's a SWAT officer or something like that, and all those are all self-published from what I think as well. This one is much more about the victims, and I think the victims have got lost in a lot of these stories, because when you hear the numbers, 58 deaths, 851 injuries, they just become numbers. And you mentioned earlier, William, that there's so many of these mass casualty events that happen, and they don't unfortunately don't seem to be stopping. That I think this event and some of the others, certainly, they kind of just sort of washed out and almost forgotten away. And what we wanted to do is make sure that certainly this evening is not forgotten. Mary Jo wants to make sure her husband is not forgotten. All the other people chronicled in this book want to make sure their story is not forgotten, and know that things can happen to you, and you can actually still move forward and kind of find that new path in life. And that's what we try to do here, is kind of create that silver lining. And I think every chapter in this book sort of has every chapter is wrapped up with a nice little bow. It's a little tease to give you right there.
Yeah, I enjoyed reading through it, and I like the perspective of the victims. It's often overlooked. I've done way too much true crime, and just like you said, it's usually from the perpetrator's perspective or law enforcement or something like that. So this is a refreshing change. Do you have a website, or do you have a way people can contact you if they have any additional questions or anything?
Yeah, I mean, you can. My personal, I'm on Instagram quite a bit. It's the Mark Gray at Instagram. That's my Instagram handle.
And that's the best way to reach you, is through Instagram at Mark Gray.
That's the best way. Yeah. Then also there's also a book Instagram. It's the Las Vegas Massacre Connections. Gotcha. On Instagram as well.
Cool. I will put links to both of those. Yeah. I'm sorry. Continue.
Beautiful. Yeah. No, and that's those are the best ways. There's a website of the same name, Las Vegas Massacre Connections, or through the publisher, which is Blue Press.
Gotcha. So there's a lot of ways. So I'll put a link to your website and Instagram there. And thanks so much for your time and for writing the book. Congrats on the book. Hopefully I'll
Thank you so much.
see you
William.
publish some in the future. Again, the author is Mark Gray, Gray, and the full title of the book that we talked about today is The Las Vegas Massacre Connections, Finding Strength Through Tragedy After America's Deadliest Mass Shooting. Thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, William.
All right, stay there. Stay there. Don't run off.